What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is David Dorr, the co-founder of DAM, a Cayman Islands-based proprietary trading firm that specializes in discretionary global macro. David has also been a longtime student of UFOs, or what we now call UAP, and has continuously emphasized the need for the entire financial community to sit up and take notice of what he believes is a massive market-impacting revelation and life-changing moment for humanity. In the first hour, David and I discussed the history of and evidence for the UFO phenomenon, including well-documented mass sightings experienced by both military and civilian populations in Washington, D.C., Phoenix, Arizona, Colares, Brazil, and many other locations across the globe. We discuss what the U.S. government's agenda may be in controlling the disclosure of information related to UAP, and how to make sense of this phenomenon if you reject the premise that all of this is some kind of government psyop or deep state conspiracy. In the second hour, we explore the intersection of mystery cults and Nazi history with UFOs and UAP, including the role of consciousness in helping to explain some or all of this phenomenon. David also explains how he and his firm think about and incorporate UAP disclosure risk in their investment model, the impact that further disclosures could have on the stocks of various defense contractors who may be benefiting from their possession of UAP materials, and how eminent domain language found in the UAP Disclosure Act could further complicate investors' efforts to capitalize on new acknowledgments in the months and years to come. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. Lastly, because this conversation deals with investing, nothing we say on this podcast can or should be viewed as financial advice. All opinions expressed by me and my guests are solely our own opinions and should not be relied upon as the basis for financial decisions. And with that, please enjoy this highly informative and valuable conversation with my guest, David Dorr. David Dorr, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thank you, Demetri. Pleasure to be here.
It's exciting having you on, David. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
So we're going to explore a topic that I have devoted 2 episodes to in the past, which is not a lot for this program. There are certain subjects that I've devoted endless number of episodes to. I did one with Diana Pasulka about a year ago. It was shortly after the congressional hearings on UAP happened. And so my interest in doing that episode was basically I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was this thing that had befuddled me, and we'll get into that. It's relevant. And so I did this episode with Diana, which was focused on, I think the actual title was like, what's up with the UAP phenomenon, or like, why won't this go away? That was certainly the subtext. And then I did one very recently, which came out today, with Lou Elizondo on the government's program, ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that was focused on understanding what exactly has been going on with UAP within the Defense Department because of all these different programs that have existed. Some of these are legacy programs that have been inherited over time. And also like, how are defense contractors involved in all of this? And like, where is possibly craft material housed? Where is biological material housed? To what extent ATIP focused on a larger grand unified theory of UAP is unclear. It seems like OSAP, which was a legacy program that came before ATIP, was more focused on that and stuff that happened at Bob Bigelow's Skinwalker Ranch. Bob sold the ranch to somebody else recently, but we might get into that. So this is going to be a conversation that is in somewhat a continuation of both of those discussions, because I know more and you know much more. So I'm able to ask questions that I maybe wasn't able to ask before, and you're able to answer them. And then also we're going to devote the second hour to exploring some of the investment-oriented themes around this, both from a risk management perspective with respect to disclosure and also opportunities to maybe invest around some of this potential either technology or technology that comes out of warehoused technology within some of these military contractors or whatever else. I mean, there's also private sector initiatives that we can discuss. So before we get into any of that, David, just introduce yourself to our audience. Who are you? How did you get interested in this subject? Because what's interesting also here is that this is not an accredited subject area. There's no, you can't really study, except maybe in some universities you can kind of get into paranormal things. But for the most part, this is something people do on the side. So how did you get into this phenomenon, and what is your day job?
Yeah, so my day job is I run a proprietary trading firm, and our specialty is in discretionary global macro. And that alone probably hints at why we got into this, because as I joke, we've long past left global macro, and we're now in a galactic macro type conversation. And that's not just because of the UAP conversation. That's because, humanity is progressing and space is a big part of what's going on in the world. As everybody knows, that's a big conversation. But my background on UAP is rather interesting. It's a childhood background. My father was fascinated with paranormal everything. So that included, studying ESPs, studying UFOs. And I really credit my father with probably the career path that, I ultimately took, which was working in financial markets. And my dad always had this perspective that the world, the universe, it's a very mysterious place. And it's always good to keep an open mind, but yet a critical mind. You want to be open that there's many possibilities, arguably infinite possibilities out there, but you want to have a discerning mind to evaluate and analyze and try and understand stuff. And so that combination turned out to be a perfect mix for analyzing and understanding the subject. So I grew up around it, listened to all the interviews, grew up listening to Coast with Art Bell and then George Knapp being on there and everybody else. Fantastic program. So that's, years and years and years of listening to that. I remember as a kid when Bob Lazar's story broke with George Knapp. So all those things, when people talk about some of the historical stuff, I remember those things. Phoenix Lights, for example, which we'll probably get into later. But the big thing for this becoming a part of my professional background was really the crossover in 2017, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. But 2017 was so monumental, going from, a fun hobby, really interesting themes, to, hey, we need to really take this serious as an investment firm, moving capital around, because in 2017 was, of course, when we saw a full kind of chain of custody of 3 videos released from the Pentagon, something that had never happened in U.S. UFO history. And we knew that was a turning point. So that's how it kind of blended together, both childhood, past, and present.
Excellent. So I'm glad you raised 2017, because that was also a watershed moment for me. This is a subject that interested me. I started taking an interest in it when I was around 12 or 13. I started reading some books about it. Of course, I'd always seen those movies, like E.T. and other alien movies. We talked about Flight of the Navigator, which was a beautiful film from Disney that you told me you think is one of the best films that fictionalizes this phenomenon. And it was so funny because I hadn't heard anyone else ever say that. And I remember this film and I need to go back and watch it. So I was interested in it as a kid, and then I kind of forgot about it, let it go. I also remember waiting with great anticipation for the airing of Alien Autopsy.
Yeah. So
this was something that fascinated me as a kid, and a lot of kids take interest in this, but I let it go over time. And I sort of took the view of, well, I'm not opposed to the idea that there are aliens. I mean, in point of fact, it seems unlikely that there wouldn't be intelligent life on other planets, given just how many solar systems there are in the universe. But I have no reason to believe that aliens have visited us. And that seemed counterintuitive, that there would be ongoing visitations by intelligent life forms. Forget aliens, actually. This is not the right term. I think UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, is actually a great term. It isn't just good because it disabuses us of stereotypes that we have in our heads about what a UFO is, flying saucers, little green men, but also because it actually, I think, is a more accurate term, because this is a phenomenon. It's not clear how bounded it is and what falls within this category. So I was interested in all of this stuff. And then I kind of let it go as I got older because, that's what you do, I guess, because I couldn't find any way to justify claims because I would have expected that there would be much more evidence for this phenomenon. And so before the hearings, 2017 happened, and we had these sightings from the USS Nimitz, and then Ryan Graves' account, which was, I forget what strike group that was off the coast of Virginia, off the East Coast, that had also both visual confirmation of this phenomenon, or one version of it, as well as radar and infrared camera readings. I was sort of like, this doesn't make sense. Like, this doesn't make sense any way I kind of look at it. It doesn't make sense from the way that I used to look at it, but it also doesn't make sense because it's like, well, what is the other explanation? There's some kind of giant government psyop. And that's kind of where I was for years. I was just waiting for more information to come out. And then eventually we had those hearings, and it was especially David Grush's testimony that confused me, where I was like, really, what is he talking about? There's biological material being housed at military contractors. This, again, breaks my paradigm. I can't quite wrap my arms around it. It doesn't make sense. And the reason I say all of this is because I think this is a good way to enter into this subject. And this is my argument. My argument is that you can't ignore this anymore. The reason why you can't ignore it is because it doesn't make sense one way or the other, unless, you're already involved in it. There's no obvious explanation, even if you're a skeptic. Because then you have to also say, well, how on earth does it make sense that we're having all these hearings? And are you saying that this is a government conspiracy that they're creating? How is all this being faked? Who's in on this? Are all these military pilots just lying? So I say all this because I think it's important for people to understand why I'm covering this subject and why it's important. And I think it's a serious subject to cover because we need to understand what's going on one way or the other. So I guess my first question for you, David, is how does a rational person, a serious person, maybe rational isn't the right word to use, a serious person, make room for the UAP phenomenon within their existing frameworks, or how do they expand their frameworks to encompass UAP without undermining some fundamental beliefs that aren't necessarily inconsistent with this phenomenon?
Yeah, it's an important question. And this is something that I've thought about a lot over the last couple of years, especially as it entered my, the professional side of my life. As a hobby, well, it's fun and doesn't really matter. You don't need serious people to pay attention, and it's not as important. But we do need serious people to pay attention. It is worthy of that. It's fantastic that you've picked this up as something to share with your audiences. And I think that the more that people pay attention to this, the more intrigued they'll be and realize that it's an enormously serious conversation. So the way I usually start people off is the general population. There's different polls on this over the years. The general population believes that we're not the only intelligent life in the universe. So that's a very easy starting point, right? Now, some people think that, it's very rare in the universe, and any other advanced life may be very, very, very far away, millions, if not billions of light years away. Some people think that advanced life is, ubiquitous and it's all over the universe. It doesn't really matter where you fall on that spectrum. The first piece is just an acknowledgement that it's mathematically probable that we are not alone in the universe, at least as we see it and we understand it. So that's a good starting point, because if we can acknowledge that, then we can start to get into the conversations about, is advanced life, is it visiting us? Or, as we'll talk about a little bit later, was it already here? Is a profound question to think about. But the next step that I say to everybody is, okay, now let's talk about, is some other form of intelligent life visiting us? And this is a great opportunity to introduce some new terminology, some new definitions that are coming directly, by the way, from the Pentagon. And as you alluded to earlier, the change from UFO to UAPs was a very smart change in redefining what it is that we're trying to characterize. So for those listening, UFOs is the old term, unidentified flying objects. There was a related term to that, by the way, called USOs, which was unidentified submerged objects. So UAP is a better catch-all. So UAP, kind of the progression, we went from UFOs. The first definition of UAP was unidentified aerospace undersea phenomenon. And then the finalized version was unidentified anomalous phenomenon, which is a fantastic catch-all. And the reason for that is because flying implies certain characteristics of physics as we understand it with lift, and Lou Elizondo's commented on this. And so it's better to list it as anomalous. Now, also the reason that they've kind of done this catch-all is because what we're going to get into talking about, from an evidentiary perspective, is that these things are transmedium, meaning that we're seeing these things in space, we're seeing them in our atmosphere, and we're seeing them under the ocean. Now, the next definition is also very important, and this is going to go back to what we're talking about with intelligent life. So we no longer, the U.S. government, the Pentagon, no longer they don't use the term extraterrestrial. They don't use the term alien. Extraterrestrial quite literally means off Earth, right? So outside of Earth. They've redefined that also with a catch-all term, which is NHI, and stands for non-human intelligence. And just kind of an asterisk on that, I would personally include artificial intelligence underneath that category. So you've got NHI. Are we encountering UAP and NHI here on Earth in our reality? That's the question. And we have, as it turns out, the big thing that people ask is, where's the evidence, right? That's the first thing everybody asks. One of the favorite questions is, if UFOs are here, or UAP now, why haven't they landed on the White House lawn? And this is always a great opportunity to say, well, they almost did. So when we look at the historical record, there's fantastic, records. We scrambled jets in 1952 with UAP flying over the White House. And so that's just the beginning. What you find, and this was, when you and I were talking offline, I loved your comment on this, is that it turns out it's not a lack of evidence. There's just an overwhelming amount of stuff to look at. And of course, there's plenty of nonsense in there. So the physical record is really the next aspect of the conversation for those entering it.
So I want to drill into that overall idea. But before I do, I want to actually clarify your comment about the Washington D.C. sightings, because people hear that and they think, what kind of underground community of information are you relying on? What is the actual evidence for this? And also, what publications commented about this at the time? How did this come out? How much knowledge is there of this, and why are people unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, great question. I think that there's just a general overall tendency for humanity to have amnesia, right? So how many people are talking about anything from the 50s on any type of regular basis? Almost nobody. Which papers covered it at the time, I don't recall, but major newspapers.
I thought it was the Washington Post was one of them.
Yeah, very likely. Like I said, I don't recall which one specifically, but it was public information. You can go and look it up. This wasn't something that was, later declassified or remains classified and is just a rumor amongst the UFO community. This is an event that was, witnessed and can be independently verified in the historical record. And it turns out there's a lot of things like that. There's a whole bunch of things like that, which is helpful because when people start their exploration, I would tell everybody, don't jump into the UFO community. The UFO community is very noisy. There's a lot of stuff there. It's a lot harder to filter out, but there's perfectly good information that's publicly available to start with. FBI declassified information, CIA declassified information. There's reading libraries on all their sites where you can see this stuff.
So I just want to encourage people to look up that specific story. I haven't studied it because, again, so I know so little about this. I'm in the very early stages of it, so I want people to bear with me. But I have looked into it a little bit. It seems legit. There, you could go to the Wikipedia pages to link through to articles on the Washington Post and elsewhere. This falls in the category of the Phoenix Lights, which I remember as a kid. I remember watching this either live on TV while it was happening or afterwards on news programs. And I think this was 1997 when this happened.
Yes.
Okay, so
I believe it was March 97. Yeah, I remember where I was.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have to go into that, at least not just yet, because again, I don't want to overwhelm people, but it's not like there isn't actually evidence of unexplained aerial phenomena or unexplained anomalous phenomena. There's another video that's available on YouTube. I think it was posted 13 years ago. I don't know if it's 13. It might be older. Sure. And I say this also because we're now in this era of deep fakes and more compelling fake videos, which is going to challenge our ability to investigate this remotely without having firsthand information or getting information through a SCIF or some kind of classified process. But there's a video of people in New York City seeing these for 10 minutes, this video is, or longer, or 20 minutes of these dancing lights in the sky. And the behavior of this phenomenon is also so bizarre. It's similar to what I saw in this video, was somewhat similar to how Commander Fravor described the Tic Tac that was moving kind of like a ping pong ball over the water. Yes. So to bring it back to this larger argument that I'm trying to make, or that we're trying to make here, which is that it isn't necessarily the lack of evidence. It isn't necessarily that there isn't evidence of this phenomenon. Rather, it seems that there's a lot of evidence of it, but that there's some other kind of block in either people's mental perception of it or in the role of authoritative institutions in normalizing it. I think that's also very important.
Yes.
For me personally as well. I mean, the 2017 New York Times article began to normalize this because authoritative sources started saying it was legitimate. Now, that doesn't mean just because an authority says it doesn't make it true. Something can be true independently of that, of course.
Right.
But it's an important piece of information, one way or the other. So how much of it do you think is like this kind of mental block / there haven't been authoritative statements made by like government or mainstream news outlets giving credence to this that explains people's inability to see the evidence?
Well, it is a fact. We know from declassified documents now, again, that can be read, directly on the U.S. government's, websites, that there were campaigns of disinformation as it relates to UAP. That's a fact. And there's lots of conversation presently about what remains of disinformation campaigns, which is a very complex topic. But if we just work off the historical record, what's been disclosed and what we know to be true, the idea of creating a stigma around UFO sightings was intentional. That was absolutely intentionally designed. And we had, the Project Blue Book, which was completely just a fake project to appease the public and wave away that, hey, we investigated tons of this stuff. There's nothing to see. Because, you go back to the 50s and the 60s, their UFO sightings was everywhere. It was pop culture at that time. You also had too, that I think is, again, worth mentioning. We don't need to deep dive into it right now. But in the 50s, you also had a lot of conversation about breakthrough technologies and addressing anti-gravity. So back then, everybody thought that, we're going to be living in the world like the Jetsons, and it's right around the corner. That was public conversation. That wasn't, some corner of, people, believing in aliens. That's important. And again, we can touch on that later, but I think that historical record is also very interesting. So it's not surprising that today that stigma runs strong. And that stigma was so strong. One of the cases that's always stuck with me was a case in 1987, I believe, with a Japanese pilot for Japanese Airlines. And he was flying over Alaska. And this guy is, if you see some of the old interviews with this guy is like the exact pilot you want on all of your flights. This is a serious career commercial pilot. This is a no BS kind of guy. And he reported seeing a gigantic UFO. He drew a picture of it. It was enormous as he was flying over Alaska. And he was one of the first commercial pilots with the courage to come forward. And I don't believe he lost his job, but he was threatened with losing his job. It's been a big issue. Ryan Graves has talked about this. He's got a whole organization destigmatizing this for commercial pilots because they're all worried that they'll lose their jobs. That's how successful developing the stigma was. So it's understandable that people feel that way.
I think there's really, and we're not going to do it here because we have so many other things that I want to talk about, but maybe it's worth just devoting a single episode to finding somebody who has kind of studied the way in which this type of self-censoring operates.
Absolutely.
To dig deeper into understanding it, because it's not just true on this subject, it's true on everything,
Yes.
It was true with COVID, it's true everywhere.
Yes.
And people are really good at understanding kind of what's appropriate to talk about, what's inappropriate to talk about. And it'd be interesting to kind of look into how that works. So let's talk about what some of the most compelling pieces of evidence are that we are aware of. And I think you're a good person to kind of list that. So let's list out a few. Give me the first one, for example. What do you think is the single most compelling piece or pieces of evidence that you've ever come across?
I think that it's not necessarily any single piece. It's tempting, of course, to mention Roswell, which is arguably the most famous UFO case, right? And the reason it's famous without going into a deep dive is that because originally when the Air Force showed up, they said that it was a UFO, and then they completely changed their statement 24 hours later, and they BS everybody that it's a balloon.
What exactly did they say when they first showed up? Like, what were the actual statements that were taken by the press?
Yeah, it was along the lines of effectively that it was a flying saucer, which is amazing.
And this was military people saying that they saw flying saucers, or it was everyday citizens saying they saw flying saucers, or both?
No, it was the U.S. Air Force. So the U.S. Air Force had put out a statement immediately after arriving on the scene, and then completely reversed that statement. That's one of the things that made it kind of such a scandal and has been a bookmark for everybody. But that was not the first UFO crash in the United States. And again, this history, as people dive into this, goes further back. What I find compelling it's a mix of things. So, for example, I'll list a couple for the audience that they can look up. I put some of these down. Some of the original photos that have been out there. So one that people can look up is the Calvine, Scotland photo from August 4th in 1990, which is an incredible photo. It was held by an RAF personnel for 30 years, and a couple years ago came back out into the public. Incredible. You look at that photo. I prefer the photos from the 90s and older because there's less arguing about, well, maybe it's a drone, maybe it's AI or things like that. These are photos that have been in the public record for a while. Another great one, this is absolutely for sure one of my top favorites, is Lake Cote in Costa Rica, September 4th, 1971. So this was taken by a plane that was doing aerial mapping for Costa Rica. Classic UFO, you're flying actually above it. It's an awesome photo. And then what I find really interesting is some of the big mass sightings, of which, by the way, there's been a ton. A lot of them south of the border. But within the United States, I think two of the biggest ones, most people are familiar, as you mentioned earlier, the Phoenix Lights, which is incredible. It's an incredible case. Like anybody that goes and looks at that and the number of people that saw it, the descriptions, these were not just some military flares, set off over the mountains. Another one that the audience likely is not familiar with, but was a mass sighting within the United States, was in as recently as 2008. So January 8th, 2008 in Stephenville, Texas, was a mass sighting as well. And these are reported by sheriffs, police officers, doctors, the whole town saw it. And you had an object that was moving over and described as being as big as a Walmart and just silently, moving over. Is this some type of mass delusion? No, I don't believe so. And people that are experts in what mass delusion even looks like have said there's a way to vet that. They know how to look through that. So those cases, just to throw out a sprinkling of them, I think are really, really, really all compelling.
So let's talk about a few of these. Also, I just want to note that in my conversation with Lou Elizondo, I don't know if we talked about it in that episode, but he and I have talked about it offline. And this is something that he's been public about, so I'm not like sharing something that he's not comfortable sharing, and as if he would share something with me that he wasn't willing to share with the public. But he's made the case that, or he's said that the U.S. Air Force is at the center of this cover-up and has been at the center of this cover-up for years. So I just want to emphasize that because you brought up the U.S. Air Force. Yes. I have not seen some of these pictures. So this, I'm looking at it right now, the Calvine photograph.
Yeah.
This is, first of all, this is incredible. How can we be confident this is real?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, it's very difficult to say with 100% certainty that these things are, that it's a real photo. And that's why, and again, I think this is valuable coming from my financial background is, we think in terms of probabilities, right? What's the probability that it was real? What's the probability of different photos from different people, different methods of vetting them? What makes the Calvine photo interesting is it was, if my recollection is correct, I believe it was two young men were hiking or around the area walking or went out for a smoke break or something. They snapped the photo and the RAF came out and investigated and basically took it. That's why an RAF member was sitting on it for 32 years, expecting somebody to come and knock on his door and investigate. If you go online, there's a whole story about the background on it. But ufologists really like that one and consider it highly probable. The one in Costa Rica is great too, because that's directly from the Costa Rican government. What you find in Latin America, and that's something that I think is really, really worthy of discussion at the right point, is that Latin America is really much, much, much more open about the UAP topic. And there's tremendous, tremendous information and data throughout all of Latin America, from Mexico all the way down. Brazil's very open about it. Lou talks about Brazil and the Colares event. So there's a great one. If people want physical evidence, you got UAP, NHI, you got physical effects on people, injuries, and, cover up large, and that was basically blocked from being publicly discussed. So there's a ton. I mean, you just go one after another after another.
Yeah, I think, so actually I've wanted to do an episode for several years. This was actually the first UFO episode I wanted to do because I was coming at it from a much more skeptical angle. And this guest was not necessarily a skeptic. I think he actually is a believer that this is a real phenomenon. But his angle of inquiry had to do with the impermissibility of this subject being talked about legitimately in the United States specifically. And that having to do with the national security state and the effect that acknowledging a power more powerful than the United States military, what that would mean for American society, the American psyche. And I just found that fascinating. He's someone that I'm going to have on. He's just been working on a book for a long time, and he doesn't want to come out and do the episode until then. But so like that's a fascinating picture. We don't have to go into the details of the other one that happened in Costa Rica, but it looks more like a traditional flying saucer. This is also fascinating, David, and I want to talk about it. There are two things that I want to mention with this. One is the evolution of our understanding of now let's depart from the UAP and talk specifically about the traditional UFO. We have always thought about the UFO, I think, as a flying saucer, right? As two saucers, one on top of encasing each other, right? Like one upside down over the other. That's how we've always thought about the UFO. And I feel like in recent years, many of us have become aware of this phenomenon being much more varied. Sometimes it's a tic tac. Sometimes it's like this thing that you showed me just now doesn't even fall in the category of anything that I've seen up until now. We've seen triangles. We've seen cubes inside of bubbles. And I wonder, do you think this is just... Well, I was going to say that this might be a perceptual defect of people's experiences, but then you're also seeing it in photographs. So is there some kind of visual distortion that's happening, do you think, that's causing the same thing to appear differently? Or do you think these are actually different expressions of the same phenomenon or different phenomena?
This is a deep question because there's various answers and angles to it. So I'll try and kind of coherently go through them. One is that, yes, the typical flying saucer is what most people visualize in their head and is common. But even within that, the variations are all over the place. So you see some that looks like it's kind of got a top hat. You see some that are more stretched out, all types of what we call, the classic saucer shape. But it comes in a lot of formats, almost an unlimited number. The triangle is something that seems to be a more recent thing, although there's evidence even in the historical record that those have been around before. But the triangle one, a lot of people believe that those might be more closely related to successful craft that perhaps U.S. government reverse engineered and has up there. So the Aurora TRB is one that people point to a lot. I don't know. That might be the case. It might not. But there does seem to be more triangle sightings kind of, post late 80s and onward. What you're describing, though, is, I think, really, really interesting and doesn't get enough attention, which is what we could broadly describe. The question you're asking is about morphologies, right? Do UFOs, take a kind of a standard set of morphologies? And is what we're seeing an effect of, the craft? So there's several scientists that believe that one of the reasons that it's difficult to get clear pictures, especially with, high-tech stuff, is because whatever the anti-gravity propulsion system, whatever technology they're using is creating some type of fields of distortion, making them fuzzy or hard to capture. But beyond that, what's really interesting, there's two aspects of this that I find fascinating, is that you have multiple witness accounts that in various circumstances, you have a close encounter, a very close-up visual, multiple people seeing it that are credible, and each one reports something totally different. And we're going to need to touch on this because that's where you get into the kind of the interaction with these things, whatever they may be, and the human brain, which is really important and needs to be paid attention to. And then that goes into the next piece, which is that forever in the historical record and the present record is that there seems to be some type of mimicry aspect. So we know for sure that these things have mimicked other things, clouds, right? Maybe it's a camouflaging technique. Maybe not. They've mimicked things almost as if what they might expect us to see. And that includes things like planes and helicopters. And that's very strange. We don't know why they're doing that, but that is a real thing that's been recorded multiple times.
So I want to mention something that I forgot to say, which is that the Phoenix Lights story, again, this is why this phenomenon has to be taken so seriously. The governor said he saw it. Okay, the governor said that he saw not the Phoenix Lights. Yes, he saw the Phoenix Lights, but he reported something that other people have reported independently. Again, this was a mass sighting, that he saw something equivalent of like an aircraft carrier in terms of its size, like 3 football fields coming over his head. And again, the fact that these are mass sightings is, I think, just really important. Yes. You have to be able to come up with an explanation for why so many people over so many years why we've had so many of these mass sightings, and what explains that. So let's go back to the mimicry thing for a second. First of all, how do we know that they're actually mimicking? If you're seeing a helicopter, what makes you think that's a UFO? Like, I don't get the evidence for that.
Yeah, so this is one of the aspects that for so long has fascinated me, is that what happens, and UFO investigator Jacques Vallée and John Keel have reported on this in their books. So you would have sightings where, let's say, I'm going to just make up an example. You see something that looks like a 747, right? And maybe it's coming in for a landing, to a nearby airport where you live. But it's moving weird. It's almost like if a kid created it and tried to do it for what it thought that you thought that it should look like. And so it moves in ways that basically don't, meet normal flight characteristics, right? And it'll turn funny. It's basically, I'm going to just use the best description I can to put this into words. It's like a UFO that has anti-gravity properties trying to disguise itself and pretend that it's a plane, but without really knowing how we operate planes in our version of physics. And that's a thing that has been going on for a long time, all the way back to the late 1800s with airships.
I want to channel the skeptic listener here, because I also, when I hear this, I think, well, that doesn't make sense either, because if this intelligence is so much more advanced than we are, they would be able to figure out how to camouflage themselves in a convincing manner. They wouldn't be able to be smart enough to create an image of a 747, but then not figure out how to navigate it into the ground. All they need to do is look at videos of how it's done. They can figure it out. And this is where I think that the challenge is, and where I don't want to lose people, which is that you and I are, and you've been studying this for so long, and there's so much more information and valuable information to extract from you that I'm probably not in the best position to do right now. But the thing that I always want people to keep in mind as we're going through this is we're trying to figure out what this is, or try to wrap our arms around it, or talk about it. That doesn't negate, even if we're saying things that don't make sense, that doesn't negate that the overall thing doesn't make sense. It goes back to my point. Like, there's something real here that we need to figure out. And it doesn't, the traditional frameworks that we have and explanations, they just don't fit. This makes me think a little bit about the government's agenda. Because again, like, the reason that I got interested in this phenomenon again is because of the New York Times article in 2017 and the mention of ATIP and Lou Elizondo and the government's interest in studying this thing. What is the government's agenda in all this, do you think?
Oh, man, that is such a heavy question. We could go with let's start with the simple and then work into the complex. And with this whole conversation today, what I encourage audience members to do is take what you find useful, discard everything else, right? So maybe some folks will be like, that's completely insane that UFOs are mimicking and toying with us. Other people might think that other aspects are, and that's totally fine. There's so much to this topic that people can find which pieces are interesting, and I encourage everybody to investigate. So the government aspect, one thing we know for certain is from the national security perspective. That is being screamed, loudly by everybody that's coming forward. It's a NatSec issue. And that's not hard for anybody to get their brains around. How could it not be, right? How could it not be just an absolutely gigantic NatSec issue? If it is true that multiple of our best, technological systems for the U.S. military are corroborating that we have things defying physics as we understand it, then that is a gigantic national security issue.
Well, we also have Navy pilots saying they've almost been hit by these craft. So obviously it's a national security issue.
Yeah. So the national security issue, and look, if you go back to, the National Security Act, the formation of the CIA, the formation of the NSA, some people would say that it's not a coincidence that all that happened, right after Roswell. And like I said, there were a cluster of other, crashes and lots of UFO reports.
Well, you could also argue, when was Roswell? 47?
47, yeah.
You could also argue that they were just beginning to develop the security apparatus for fighting the Cold War.
Absolutely.
Right. So, I mean, I don't necessarily know that that's necessary to look at Roswell, but feel free to respond and tell me why I'm wrong.
I wouldn't suggest that you're wrong. I would just add more to it, is that one of the most powerful things with increases in sightings, and this is something that I think is worth talking about, because there's events, there's things that seem to cluster encounters, right? And one of those big ones is nukes.
And this is undisputable? Undisputable.
Yeah, there's so much documentation on that. I remember hearing that stuff. My dad was really into that when I was a kid. And then there's a great book that's called UFOs and Nukes, which everybody should check out. That's probably one of the definitive.
I think Lua Elizondo has also referenced that either to me or on the show.
Yeah, it's a great book. And then the SCU has done 2 papers on that data as well. So there's just tons and tons and tons. And now you have, what's great is you now have people on the record. You have Lua Elizondo saying that too, that these things are interested in our nuclear capabilities. So let's go back and let's look at that, right? So when we think about the U.S. security apparatus and its development and after World War II and all these things, it's not a crazy leap to see these things intertwined. And what a lot of people have said is that one of the reasons that it's so hard and it's so buried, imagine, let's look at this both ways. Let's look at this from other advanced life, right? Okay, the monkeys have figured out how to make an atomic bomb. We should probably drop in and check on them, right? That's one theory. That would be logical. You'd be concerned if you're monitoring life, anywhere else, you might want to come and take a look and see what's going on. Now let's look at it from our perspective. We've just created the atomic bomb. And so we have this, what we consider an advanced understanding of physics. And then all of a sudden you got stuff that's completely blowing our minds and defying physics as we presently understand it. How could you not be freaked out?
Assuming we're trying to explain this phenomenon using a materialist framework. And other examples could be we're living in a simulation, or also we're completely tripping balls here. We have no clue what's going on. We have no concept of reality whatsoever. Right. So there are many other ways to view it. And I actually made the argument to Lua Elizondo that if you're trying to take the Occam's razor approach, those other 2 explanations actually are the simpler ones.
Yes, I agree. They're usually tougher conversations for people to digest, but I'm in complete agreement. You go down this path and you look at potential explanations, it's very difficult to not arrive at those types of things.
And I don't want to lose your train of thought there, David, but I just want to reemphasize again, we have multiple sightings that have been publicized of Navy pilots who are people who professionally have the best vision, witnessing this, testifying that they've been doing it, got on media to do appearances, radar, camera footage, and the assertion that there are hundreds of such testimonies and pieces of evidence, including high definition video that has not been released and that plans to be released. So again, if this isn't real, there's an insanely complicated conspiracy by elements of the government, which shatters our paradigm of the complexity of conspiracy. So if you're a skeptic, you should believe that neither of these is true. You should believe that neither the government is capable of concocting this type of a conspiracy, or that it's impossible that there are UFOs or UAPs or whatever visiting us, showing up, and that we haven't figured it out by now. So both of these break our paradigm, which again brings me back to the central focus, which is this needs an explanation. I don't have one. I'm trying to figure it out. And I think everybody, especially investors, many of which listen to this podcast, should be focused on it. But I want to bring you back to where you were, David.
Yeah, I think that you make a wonderful point with that statement. And that's a go-to with a lot of people that, if this is real, this is just a big giant psyop. And if so, it would be the most well-executed psyop
And you
ever.
need to explain how it works. You need to explain how, if you're going to claim it's a psyop, you need to be able to come up with a better explanation than just, I don't trust the government. It's a psyop.
Yeah. And it's a global phenomenon too. And it's nice to see Lua Elizondo and David Grush. And again, folks like myself that, I grew up reading this stuff, I'm well aware of that, but the general public is not. This is not just something that is contained to the United States. This is absolutely all over the world. But here's something that why investors and everybody should be paying attention to it. It's not only that we're rapidly arriving to a moment where it's very clear that disclosure is on the table and it's in process, right?
More disclosure than what's already happened is your point.
Yes. Yeah. So we're in the process. I would say everything pre-2017 was zero disclosure. And, Lou and crew, 2017 and today have been pushing forward lots of wonderful stuff, legislation, And it's not just the UAP Disclosure Act that some people may or may not be familiar with, and everybody should read if they're listening. But it's also amendments within the National Defense Authorization Act over the last couple of years, which is what created the whistleblower protection, which gave the path for David Grush to come forward and testify, which was an absolutely incredible testimony last year. People can watch it online and should. But here's something that I think doesn't get picked up by general audiences and even people within the UFO community. We have an exponential increase in encounters taking place. So me as a guy, and again, maybe this is just my market brain, right? So I think a lot in terms of momentum. I think in terms of, exponential curves and stuff. These are things we look for to make trades and to have a leading advantage over, competitors or regular market participants. You have a momentum aspect to encounters. And I want to be very clear. The first thing that most people would respond is like, well, that's probably just simply because our technology's better. We just upgraded all our FLIR systems a couple years back. Who knows what other stuff.
There are also there are billions of people with high definition cameras roaming the globe today, which didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago.
Exactly. And so all of that is true. But in addition to that, we are having an exponential increase in encounters. There's nothing on the historical record, even, when we, created the atomic bomb, talking about daily encounters. We're talking about the U.S. military is not just they're having daily encounters. They're having encounters where there's fleets. That's also interesting. So there's examples of, multiple UFO sightings by people that goes all the way back into the past. But, it might be 5 or 6 or 7, but seeing, 20 or 30 or 40, that wasn't so common. That seems to be more and more common. When you look at the records around the U.S. Nimitz, people look at those videos and they think that it was just one UAP. That's not the case. There was lots, as described. It was like they're raining from the sky. Okay, so that's, now we're like NatSec on steroids. What's going on?
Seriously, man.
Yeah,
absolutely. Again, back to my point, that makes no sense. And yet what also doesn't make sense is that all these people are saying this, that there's radar readings that's just being reported and it's some conspiracy that's being covered up. I don't want to necessarily follow this thread. I just want to throw it out there for people to think about it and whatever it inspires, because I don't exactly know what it means when I say it. But one of the things that I feel when I look at all of this evidence and when I look at this phenomenon, which I can't wrap my arms around, and this also, the reason that I thought of this was your observation about increased sightings. It almost feels like there are two converging timelines here. There's the one that we've been living through, this linear timeline that we've all been living every year, since our births, and then some other timeline. And it's almost like the two are coming into contact here. Again, I just throwing that out there. I don't necessarily want to explore it. Let's talk a little bit about the perceived threat, because it seems like people like Lou Elizondo and other people within the government, especially DOD, obviously, if what you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They are trying to label this as a threat. Now, to what extent they think it's a threat, and to what extent they think it's a threat because it's their job to think it's a threat, and to what extent they say it's a threat because this is the way that they can claim ownership over it and try to get more funding for their programs and everything else, I'm not sure. I'm curious what you think is going on from their perspective. And then 2, what do you think is really going on? And do you have any reason to have an opinion on this whatsoever?
Yeah. So first, if I may, I'd like to make just kind of a quick remark about, the timeline you just referenced, because there's an interesting thought on this. My chief technology officer is a brilliant guy, used to work in the Air Force in Cyber Command and also worked at Raytheon. So better than average insights on these topics. He postulates that perhaps the increased encounters is because of our development with artificial intelligence. And he makes a great case for this because if we looking at the historical record and some of the best data points that we have with encounters with UAP being related to nukes, right? And we have so many comparisons of, AI development being, more dangerous than nukes. It's not completely unreasonable to think that perhaps that's one of the reasons that we're seeing, increases in encounters again. It's almost impossible to ignore that these timelines do seem to be moving together. Now, correlation is not causation, right? So we don't know yet, but it's interesting. So to answer your question, as far as the threat aspect. So I will say what, has been said out there for the audience, and then I'm going to give just purely my personal opinion, which is more conjecture than anything else. So definitely we know in the posturing and the statements from, ex-Pentagon officials and present ones. So Lou's left the Pentagon, but he maintains his top secret clearance. So he's still very, very, very close to the issue and classified information related to that. It's clear that they see this as a threat. That is for certain. They see it as a threat. The question as to how big a threat, I think, is what everybody should be asking themselves. Now, what I have to go off of, and what I'll remind the audience is that, again, this is speculation, but I am a professional speculator. That's what I do in markets. So my job is to risk capital based on incomplete information. So this is more opinion than anything else, but I'm going to point to real things. We have a tempo taking place. There's not just, hey, let's get disclosure out because the American public deserves it after 70 years. There is, let's get this out because there's not enough bright minds working on this. It's been too siloed. Our adversaries may be making advancements. My personal opinion, I think they probably already have. So there's a tempo that you can see. That's real. That's not just speculation. Speculating on that tempo suggests to me that the DoD thinks that there's a more specified threat, or threats plural. That's my personal view.
Okay, so do you think that one of the reasons also is the fear of catastrophic disclosure, which is another way of saying one of these objects shows up and starts hovering in the center of Manhattan and doesn't go away?
Okay. So everybody should brace themselves for what I'm going to say on this, because I have a really different take. So let's use some terms here and build this up before I respond. There are two terms that are being used as it relates to disclosure. These are terms that are coming from, ex and present military. It's controlled disclosure and it's catastrophic disclosure. And the idea is that we're being presented with this binary option, that if we're not on board for controlled disclosure, then we're going to have to live in a world where there's catastrophic disclosure. So what the hell do those two terms mean? Okay, so I'm going to do kind of my loose interpretation of them, but people can look these up and see how they've been presented. Controlled disclosure is effectively a process that goes over years. And the point of controlled disclosure is to acclimatize the public discourse over UAP and NHI. I'm not for that. I'm not for the same organization that's been lying this whole time and telling us that we're all idiots and, stigmatizing the topic to then turn around and be like, let's go slow. We're going to tell you in pieces and make sure you get comfortable. We're going to roll this out to the academic community and then so on and so forth. I don't believe in that. Not only that, I would bet against it. So I don't think governments are great at doing those kind of rollouts. So then we get catastrophic disclosure, which is what we're being presented as the other side, that it's this, like I said, it's a binary option, the way that we're being presented this. Catastrophic disclosure is, like you said, maybe these things show up, the public's not ready, our adversaries get a jump on us, our adversaries announce it first, that they've been studying it, and somehow that gives them an advantage, whether they've mastered some of the technology or they're using that for some whatever geopolitical declaration. This is what we're being presented with, okay? Now, here's where I want to build this up. So the first thing is that I don't think it's an either or an or. I think that there's already great advancements in the private sector and people, building their own technology devices to track stuff in the sky. I think there's a middle ground for discovering what is going on. But here's what I find perplexing, Demetri. Everybody should first go read the UAP Disclosure Act and go read the terms. Everybody's talking about UAP. That's the primary conversation about UAP. But the other term that's in the UAP Disclosure Act is NHI, right? Non-human intelligence. And those are, what's being referred to as the occupants of the craft. We need to have a conversation about NHI, right? So if the craft is just simply what intelligence is using, what is the role of NHI in this conversation as it relates to disclosure?
For me, my interpretation of NHI isn't necessarily occupants in a craft. It is rather an attempt to describe that this phenomenon does not act randomly. it acts as though it is being driven by some kind of intelligence. So maybe it's a drone, doesn't have to be little green men in the craft, but just that there's a signature here that is non-random and that is not acting in easily predictable ways or according to readily observable laws.
Absolutely. Absolutely agreed. And like I said, the smart part about redefining extraterrestrials as NHI is that it gives you much broader categories for what could be in that. So a lot of people have postulated that exactly what we're seeing is UFOs and even the little grays, which is a common kind of prototype that people see and report, is that those are just kind of some type of biological android. Okay. Now, the reason I'm highlighting this as something that's important is that if we take what's being put on the record, not what I'm saying, what has come out on the recent record post-2017, Grush's testimony, that we are in possession of biologics, so we have genetic material, right? We have retrieved craft intact. We have breached the hull of craft and gotten inside. These are things that have made their way into the public domain. So what has been interaction with NHI? What does NHI have to say about disclosure? Why are we not spending more time looking at that angle? Is it crazy to believe that we've had communication?
So when you're saying, what does NHI have to say about disclosure? What you're saying is it the government unilaterally deciding to disclose on its own timeline, or is this intelligence that we're experiencing through this UAP phenomenon, is this intelligence somehow interacting with leadership structures and actually controlling some of this disclosure or initiating it or compelling it forward?
Yeah, and I know this sounds absolutely crazy to most folks listening, and I went through that too. So even, being around this subject, I've kind of got like areas where it feels fringe to me, secret agreements with the government and NHI, who knows? But I'm just going off of what is being reported presently and is on the record. So NHI is a component of this. What is it? We're getting all these little, we're being drip fed that, hey, there's material, right? There's material, there's craft. Lou, talked about that on your show. Physical material that's, very interesting. How could it be fabricated? He's referenced that there's biological material. So if there's biological material, if there's biologics, if there's, aliens, NHI, what do we know? Everybody's kind of like, the Pentagon's just kind of playing dumb, like, oh, we haven't really heard anything on that yet. But what is disclosure? Why is there a controlled disclosure plan? And is it related to, some type of whatever, communication, coordination, something else that they know about that? I think that should be, looked at. Okay,
so I'm going to move us to the second hour, David. And I want to give listeners an idea of what we're going to talk about there. So one thing I do want to ask you on the other end is what you think is going on here, your most coherent theory, and what questions people should be asking, or what questions you're asking, or you would like to have answered in order to get a better understanding of what this thing is. So that's one thing.
Sure.
And then there's some other sort of miscellaneous questions, one having to do with the intersection of this with kind of mystery cults and Nazi history, and the Nazis were interested in this phenomenon. Because the other thing is that, like, you begin, as you start to study this, you begin to see intersections between the classic UFO and stuff that we have seen in places like Bigelow's Skinwalker Ranch and the paranormal. And again, is there a way for it to fold this into what we're talking about here? Also, dude, something that comes up for me quite a bit, and it's been coming up for me for years, and I've been talking about it, largely in the context of social media and the increased digitization of people's experience of the world and of themselves. And that has to do with losing touch with reality. It does feel that we're losing touch with reality, or that may simply be that we're losing touch with our simulated reality, the reality that we have been perceiving as being substantive and rock bottom and foundational, but which is in fact largely simulation. Whether it's a computer simulation or just the simulation of your perception of the world is unclear. But I do worry about that, because I feel like I'm losing touch with reality as we go through this conversation, right? Like, in order to have this conversation honestly, which again, let's reframe this before we go to the second hour. We're dealing with something here that seems inexplicable, whether it's the phenomenon itself or what would be required for this to be faked. Both don't fit my paradigm. And for me to figure this out, honestly, I've got to trash a lot of stuff. I've got to throw a lot of stuff out and restart from scratch, which is why I've opened my aperture so wide, where I'm talking about Ghostbusters type, apparitions and the traditional UFO and whatever else we're talking about, NHI convening with, the president, whatever you want. And so like in the process of doing that, I feel like I'm losing my mind. And I just want to voice that feeling that I'm having for people that out there that I know are having it also, because it is a concern, because we have operated in a world where we have largely for, the course of my entire life, and certainly I would say at least the period of the Industrial Revolution, where we have had a pretty standard set, and this started with the Enlightenment, but a pretty standard set of concepts that we use to come to consensus and to navigate the world empirically. And I feel like we're losing touch with a lot of those things, and it's not just on this topic. So that's something else I want to talk to. And I also want to discuss investment themes around this subject, whether we're talking about risk management for portfolio managers and investors. Like if you're a macro fund manager, how do you think about this thing, right? Like even if it's not real, if there's a government PSYOP or something going on and the government's going to make more disclosures, whether or not it's real, like how does that impact my investments? Either from a societal point of view in terms of people's psyches and risk tolerance, or actually like, literally I'm invested in Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman, and we found out that they've been warehousing this material. And is that bullish or is that bearish because they're going to be penalized for having concealed it? And then you also mentioned the UAP Disclosure Act, David. There's eminent domain language in there. So what does that mean in terms of what the government's going to claim ownership over, and am I invested in that? So those are just some of the things that I want to talk to you about in the second hour. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want to access the second hour of today's conversation with David, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. David, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.